everyone, welcome to the Oxford Policy Pod, a student-run podcast from the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford. My name is Nawaz, and together with Cristian today, we will be interviewing Kevin Watkins. Kevin Watkins has a long and illustrious career in international aid and development domain. He has served as the CEO of the Save the Children Foundation and various other organizations. He has also served multiple years in United Nations, including UNESCO and UNDP, where he helped design the Human Development Report. Today, with Kevin, we will be asking him questions about education policy, international development, and the future of aid in the fragmented geopolitical situation. I welcome you to the podcast, Kevin. Thank you.
Nawaz, thank you, and it's great to be with you guys.
Kevin, you've had, like my colleague here said, you've had a remarkable career spanning Oxfam, UN, Overseas Development Institute, and Save the Children. But every journey has a beginning. What first drew you to international development? And was there a particular moment or experience that you are most proud in your life or your experience in life?
Well, I think what first drew me, I was very lucky when I was an undergraduate that one of my teachers was Ruth First. And some of your listeners will know who Ruth First was. She was a South African journalist and political commentator and academic who was forced to flee. She fought very strongly against apartheid, and she was actually married to the leader of the military wing of the African National Congress, and she was eventually assassinated by South African security forces. But what I really learned from Ruth was just how important this development can sound like a very vague and abstract concept, but coming from her environment, I think she really understood and was able to communicate the significance of international development in people's lives. So I was very lucky to work under her and then under Gavin Williams in Oxford. And and of course I think anyone who thinks about the world is bound to think about, how come some countries and some people are so wealthy, and how come so many countries and so many people get left behind. So I've always been intrigued by that big question. In terms of what I'm most proud of, I I don't think pride is the right word in this context, but I've been incredibly lucky to work in all of the organizations that you mentioned, Oxfam and Save the Children, and the UN and the Overseas Development Institute, with people who are not only super smart and much smarter than me in many, many, many cases, but also deeply committed to understanding the world and to changing the world. And I think that combination of research and analysis and understanding is so important. The one thing that really stands out for me, I guess, is that when I was at Save the Children, one of the things that we focused on in what was actually the organization's centenary year, so it's 100 years old, but we had an ambition to get the issue of childhood pneumonia on the international agenda. Now, that sounds like a very niche type of issue, but childhood pneumonia is actually the biggest single killer of children around the world. It was and remains actually completely neglected on the international health agenda. But working with many governments in the global south and with civil society organizations, we actually managed to make a number of breakthroughs. So I think organizationally, we were very proud of that.
Thank you.
That's great. As someone who has also suffered from childhood pneumonia, I can concur with the work which you have done and how important it is. And also, the second thing which you mentioned was the question about how some states become developed and how some states could not become developed in their journey of progress. This is the exact same question we also discuss a lot about in our economic class, in our politics class, and throughout our course. And one of the main core topics which we discuss in international development is aid. So, with the US aid dismantled now, which accounted for almost 40% of the aid money which used to come to international organizations, and now European donors also sharply cutting back on their money which they used to give to the international organizations. Who do you think is going to fill that gap? Do you think that Global South or China is ready for that, or will there be a new player which will emerge?
Well, look, let me say, first of all, to push back a little bit on the question. Um, as an engine of development, as a driver of structural change and transformation, aid is actually not that significant. I mean, India has not grown at the rate that it's grown because of aid. The great success stories in international development, if you look at East Asia or Brazil under the first Lula administration, these are not aid success stories. Aid has played an important role in some areas, in particular global public health, uh, to some extent in education, but it's not a driver of transformation. Now, that said, as you highlighted in the question, we're in a period now of unprecedented aid cuts, and those cuts are falling very heavily both in the humanitarian area, which you mentioned. So we've seen humanitarian aid decline by around one third, very, very significant cuts, but also deep cuts for the global health mechanisms like Gavi, the Vaccines Initiative, the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis, and other areas. Those cuts will have devastating human effects, and they're already happening on the ground in countries like Sudan and countries in the Sahel and other regions. Now, the question of what the response to the aid cuts should be, first and foremost, the response has to be to reduce aid dependence. And the reality is that there are many countries, in particular across sub-Saharan Africa, that are mobilizing far less revenue domestically than they could and should be mobilizing. The revenue to GDP ratio in Africa is around 14%. The African Development Bank estimates that it could be around 20%. Now, 6% of GDP, is a sum that would make significant investments in all of the areas that are now being cut. In the interim, that's not a quick fix. It's not easy to raise revenue quickly. In the interim, I think we have to argue for the donors that are still open to reason. In other words, not the United States, but European donors, to reverse the aid cuts. And we have to argue for some of the emerging markets that have benefited a great deal from the international aid system to put more back into that system. So, I think countries like, India and Brazil and other countries could be doing a lot more. But I'll attach one caveat to that. They're not likely to do more in an aid system which precludes them from having an effective voice in governance.
Okay,
Yes.
interesting. So, Professor Kevin, I see that you mention a lot of times and you make quite a distinction between aid that goes through international organizations and bilateral aid. In your work, you always wrote that you prefer aid that goes through international organization as it's more efficient than bilateral aid. However, a lot of countries still do bilateral aid, still prefer this method of delivering aid, even though it's less efficient than that one that goes through the international organizations. Why do you think so? Is the reason that this is happening? Thank you.
Well, I think the reasons are very mixed. There's the history is important. Traditionally, some countries have attached more weight to multilateral than they have to bilateral, and vice versa. And politics is critical. These are political choices that governments make. Currently, in most years, these days, between 60% and around three quarters, 75% of international aid is directed through bilateral channels. And there's a really important point in this, which is that most of that aid does not go through government systems. It goes through projects that are overseen and managed by donors themselves. And I think there's so much evidence that that is just an inefficient way of doing aid. Many of these projects overlap. There's very weak coordination. Managing the projects and trying to establish some element of coordination imposes a huge burden on recipient governments. To give you one example, the Ethiopian government, just in the area of agriculture and social protection, has to produce around 80 reports annually to donors. Now, this is a ridiculous high transaction cost imposed on a government with limited capacity. By contrast, most multilateral aid, that includes aid that goes through the World Bank's International Development Association. It includes most of the aid that goes through the global health initiatives that I've already mentioned. That does go through government systems. So it reduces the transaction costs, it builds capacity. It begs the question, Cristian, which you rightly asked, why do donors do that? Like, why do they shoot themselves in the foot and give their very limited aid budgets in a bilateral form that's inefficient? And I fear the answer to that question is partly because they like to wrap everything in their national flag so that the public can see how generous they are. And so this is more about the image of the aid donor than the effectiveness of the aid they provide.
Yeah, interesting.
That's a very interesting take which you have taken. Now, pulling us back from the topic of aid to a new topic, you mentioned the impact of one of your teachers in your career and in your thinking in one of the questions. Uh, with the emergence of AI and improvement of technology, what we are seeing these days in the domain, especially in the developing countries, is that there has been a lot of discussion on replacing teachers with AI chatbots or systems, or those kinds of algorithmic things. What do you think are the harms or the benefits of those kinds of thinking? Do you think that effective, competent learning for children can be derived through AI, or teachers are still relevant, and this is some kind of dangerous thinking which we are having of replacing teachers with AI?
Well, look, I think some of the thinking from the tech community is frankly delusional. Um, at the same time, it's clearly the case that there is a huge potential in AI to improve the quality of education for millions of children around the world. Now, we're already seeing that in schools in rich countries. Just the basics, being able to go to through an AI app to understand processes of problem solving in mathematics, in science, and in other areas. So AI can be a fantastic learning support for children. Of that, there's absolutely no question. But a teacher doesn't just impart information. A teacher is there to identify when children are struggling. A teacher is there to provide emotional support when children need it. Teaching is like learning is an interaction. And I think it has to be, in large measure, a human interaction between a teacher and a child. Now, the idea that you can displace teachers with AI is where the delusional part of the story comes in. And let's be honest, we've seen this movie 20 times before. Like, I remember 20 years ago, they invented a low cost computer. I can't remember the name of the company that invented it now, but these were $50 or $100 computers, and every child in Africa was going to have one of these computers, and then Africa was going to close the learning gap with the West. As soon as they started rolling it out, there were minor details like, what do you do when the computer breaks down? What do you do when a teacher isn't sufficiently well trained to explain to a child a problem that they can't resolve with the aid of the computer? So, I, I, there's a lot of what I would describe as tech overreach going on in development at the moment, and this is a classic example.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So staying on this change environment, we see a lot of change in the world, and this multilateral system that we are living in is definitely is. We have a lot of evidence that it was built for a different era, and it needs to be reformed. Kevin, do you think that the multilateral system that we live in can be reformed, or do we need some new system entirely new that would address the needs of the populations?
Yeah, well, you guys really go in for some of the big questions, and this
Yeah.
is one of the really big questions. Look, I think obviously the multilateral system that we have today is the product of a different era. And I would say to anyone who's working on international development or international relations, go and read the opening speech of Henry Morgenthau, who was the US Treasury Secretary at the time of the Bretton Woods conference, which led to the creation of the IMF and the World Bank, and indirectly to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and what became the World Trade Organization. Now, you can read that speech, and when you read it, you can see they were dealing with very immediate problems. Their big concern was, how do you avoid a rerun of the Great Depression, where protectionism dragged the entire world down? How do you manage global economic governance in ways that don't give rise to extreme right wing and nationalist movements? How do you reconstruct Europe? How do you respond to the mass displacement that has happened during the war? Now, these were the questions they were grappling with. And what they came up with was clearly imperfect. It was imperfect for the mid 1940s. You've clearly been overtaken by events. But the basic structures, the UN system, the humanitarian system, the Bretton Woods agencies, were the product of that crisis in history. Now, you can look at the reality of that system, and we shouldn't be starry-eyed about it, because a lot of the language that has been used by multilateral agencies, it appeals to universal values and universal principles and human rights, but the reality has always been very different. The humanitarian system was created to do some important stuff, like saving people affected by war and emergencies. But it has also been used as a battering ram for US interests. I mean, think of Iraq and the Gulf Wars. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were created as a sort of Keynesian enterprise. And instead, they ended up imposing structural adjustment and the debt crisis on Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, and pushing governments to open their capital markets, which led to the East Asian crisis. So, there's always been one rule for the global South in international trade and another rule for the global North, with the big pharmaceutical companies and the American banks effectively writing the rules of the World Trade Organization. So, this isn't a system which has served the global south well. But what we're moving into, which is the breakdown of that rules-based order and the emergence of a new order centered on unilateral power, centered on the belief, most clearly articulated by the US, that international cooperation is a zero-sum game, centered on this idea that, that is current in these emergent right-wing populist parties, that we shouldn't be cooperating on the international stage to tackle climate change, to govern AI, apropos your earlier question. That puts us at a very dangerous moment. And I think when the rules-based order was unfair and it was inequitable. When you have no order, when you have chaos, and the playing out of pure power relationships, the winners in that system are not going to be the global south or the people that have been left behind. So the answer to your question is we urgently need a new system. And I think you can see the elements of that system in embryo. You can see it in what the global health funds do, in what the World Bank is doing, in the regional development banks. You can see it in the UN system, as inefficient as the system is and desperately in need of reform as it may be. In embryo, it's there. So I would say we do need a new multilateral order, not to meet the challenges of 1945, but to meet the challenges of the mid 2020s and the 21st century. And those challenges, some of them do overlap with where we were in Bretton Woods. Look at the rise of neo-Nazi movements, far-right movements across Europe. I mean, this is the type of concern that preoccupied John Maynard Keynes and Henry Morgenthau. We have a US Secretary of State last year who at the Munich Security Conference, rather than meeting the incoming German Chancellor, chose to meet a bona fide leader of a neo-Nazi party. So, I would say, we are in a watershed period where we need a rules-based system, but it has to be a system that's built on a broader system of governance and a system that addresses the very real challenges of today.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. As you said that the rules for the game for the global north and global south were different at that point, and that is one of the reason which also tickled the world order to dismantle what we are seeing right now. One country which is trying to position itself as the leader of global south, particularly in the digital transformation domain, is India, where I also come from. Do you think that India is ready as a country to take up that position, or do you think that it has still a long way to go?
Yeah, again, that's a big question. So, look, what I would say on let's take India as a specific emerging market, emerging country example. So, I think there are many areas in which India does offer leadership by example, and an example that could be followed in many countries around the world. If you look at the pace of the green transition in India, it's far outpacing what most countries in Europe are doing. European countries often focus on the fact that India continues to rely on coal, which is of course true, but the pace of change in India, the way that successive governments have created incentives for investment, in particular in solar, but other areas as well, is extraordinary. The way that India has developed a national economic infrastructure. I mean, India has one of the greatest understated human development achievements of any country, which is the National School Feeding Program. An extraordinary program at scale, which has done so much to reduce hunger and malnutrition among young children. So in all of these areas, of course, India provides positive examples for other countries. There are other areas in which it provides negative examples. And, I would say, if you want a country that is sort of emblematic of the dangerous rise of right-wing nationalist populist thinking, India ticks that box. This is the sort of alter ego of Donald Trump in India. And it's, in my view, as somebody who loves India, I think politically, India is in a very dangerous place at the moment. India, I think, is not going to step in and fill the gaps left by other major donors. It has a relatively small aid program. I think it's in the order of $800 million a year. So it's not that big. But I think where India scores very high is in the way that it's used concessional credit lines to support infrastructure investment, often provided through Indian companies, actually, in parts of Africa. So sorry, I'm hedging my bets a bit on India there, but
Yeah.
I think
No,
you get
no,
my drift.
No, you're very objective about it.
Yeah, that was a good answer. Thank you. So now moving across the Indian Ocean and we go to Africa. And the African continent has the youngest population on the planet at this moment. Do you think that this is a demographic dividend, or is it like a bomb, a ticking bomb for Africa if they don't invest in education, jobs, or development in the future?
Well, it's both. I mean, it's a demographic opportunity,
Yes.
which, if it is squandered, will have deeply adverse implications for Africa and for the world, actually. And I think the way you frame the question is exactly right. That if the median age in Africa today is 19. The median age in Europe is 45. You
Yeah.
just think
Yeah.
of that
Yes.
stark difference. Africa today is around, I think around 20% of the world's just under 20% of the world's population. By 2050, it will be over 1/4 of the world's population. Now, the flip side of that is that you've got tens of millions of young Africans entering labour markets over the next 2 decades, 2 to 3 decades annually. And, therein lies the opportunity, because if those new entrants to the labour market are equipped with the opportunities for health, the opportunities for education, the opportunities for skill development, that becomes a tremendous asset for social and economic transformation, and actually globally a unique asset, because in most other countries, populations are actually set to decline over time. The flip side of that story is if those young people enter labour markets that are unable to provide jobs on the demand side, and they enter labour markets on the supply side lacking the human capital they need to raise productivity. The effects, I think, you don't need high level economics to work out the implications, like a big increase in labor supply in a market where jobs are not being created, where productivity is stagnant, where climate change is having devastating impacts on agriculture in particular. So, the risks here are enormous, as is the opportunity. And I think the big challenge for governments in the region and for the international community is how do you mitigate the risks while seizing the opportunity? And there aren't easy answers to that. But I think you have some great teachers in the Blavatnik school who are
Mhm.
thinking in a serious way about how to address it.
Yeah.
I think we have some teachers who, and we have the African Center who is also thinking about
Yeah.
the problem.
Yeah. Now, taking a question from your illustrious career at the UN, you were part of the UNDP and you were part of the team which basically coined down the Human Development Report, in which you gave an alternative to measuring progress beyond GDP and growth numbers. So, do you think that states and countries right now are in a position to adopt that kind of a thinking, or in this geopolitical turmoil you will see that states will just focus on growth other than focusing on any other measurable indicator for human progress kind of a thing?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So the Human Development Report was really the brainchild of two economists, Amartya Sen. Well, Amartya was much more than an economist; he's a philosopher, economist, and many other things, and Mahbub Haq. And I think what they were trying to get at was the the very simple fact that economic growth, whilst clearly being a condition for the sustainable reduction of monetary poverty, didn't always go hand in hand or wasn't always as strongly associated as one might expect with social development. So, you would end up with these, very stark cases which they use to illustrate that point. That, a country like the United States, which could be at the top end of the scale for GDP, actually performs pretty much like an average middle income country on indicators like maternal mortality, for example. And, to take a country that you're interested in, India, India is far wealthier than Bangladesh, but Bangladesh has better indicators for child survival than India. And so, what we were trying to do through the Human Development Report was to hold up the best examples of countries which, even if they weren't growing strongly, were performing well on these human development indicators, and to hold that up as a sort of benchmark for what is possible. And I think the degree to which governments listened to that message was very variable. I mean, I can tell you from personal bitter experience that at the time, countries like India or Mexico did not like to be unfavorably compared with their poorer neighbors. And it became almost a matter of national pride to demonstrate that, you could convert economic growth and wealth into better social outcomes. All of that said, you just have to listen to contemporary political debates, including here in the UK, to realize the degree to which GDP somehow captures the political mind or the political ethos of the times. That the country can clearly be falling apart
Hmm.
in many respects. The health system may be crumbling, schools may be underperforming, but hallelujah, we've grown at 1.5%. And I think it sort of reflects, and this is partly the political vacuum actually that populists have walked into, because while we've had, for the longest time, we had agencies like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund telling us that globalization was the best thing since sliced bread. Liberalize your trade, get rid of capital controls, and eventually you'll catch up with them. You're going to accelerate growth. There was a whole industry in the World Bank pumping out these messages: growth is good, globalization is good for the poor. And look where we are now. Look at the consequences of failing to look beyond growth and GDP to the real experiences of people who were marginalized and excluded and left behind. So I think the failure of contemporary established political parties to look beyond these sort of narrow economic and technocratic approaches to growth and to GDP is part of the problem that we're all facing.
Yeah, that's quite thoughtful of you.
Very
Yeah.
interesting. So, Kevin, now moving away from these difficult questions, you had a very illustrious career. What suggestions do you have for our students here at Oxford that are in the mid 20s? What do you think that is the best thing that young people can do to have a fulfilling career? And what is your like general advice for the young generation?
So you guys asking me for career advice?
Yeah, basically.
Basically, yes, in a form or another.
Yeah.
Well, look, I'm not going to give you career advice. I mean, here's what I would say. So I think rule one: do what you love. Like follow your passion, and don't follow the career advice that some professional might give you. Do what you love and find a way of sticking with it and enjoying it. So follow your passion is rule one. The second thing I would say is you guys have a pretty bleak inheritance from our generation, the older generation, and you're facing into, I think, challenges that are probably without precedent. I don't want to go over hyperbolic on this, but probably without precedent since the 1930s in terms of their magnitude and potential threat to humanity. And I'm obviously thinking about climate change as one exemplar of that. I'm thinking about the rise of extreme right wing parties, the rise of nationalism, the demise of multilateralism at a time when we need multilateral solutions to address our shared challenges. I'm thinking about the role of AI and the governance of AI. How do we tap into the benefits while managing the risks? So these are great challenges that you guys, your generation, is going to be facing. So I would say rule number two: you have to face up to the fact that the world as it is not the world as it needs to be. And because of your backgrounds, you're in an incredibly privileged position to help drive the change that needs to happen. The third thing I would say, I'm going to use a word which has gone out of fashion a little bit, which is solidarity. And, for a long time, the aid industry uses this very sort of paternalistic, colonial language about how richer countries are going to save poorer countries or help poorer people, and I think it misses the point. That actually, to go back to Henry Morgenthau's speech at Bretton Woods, he has a wonderful line in it where he says, if we learn nothing from this war, we need to learn that we are a community, we are an international community. There is such a thing as an international community. And that's what solidarity, I think, is about. It's about recognizing that we face shared challenges, we have shared responsibilities, and there's a shared moral imperative to tackle the climate crisis, to eradicate hunger, to do all of the things that were in the SDG shopping list but have never happened. So I would say my third rule of thumb for advice would be act in solidarity.
Yeah.
Thank you for this advice, Kevin.
Yeah.
It's very nice.
Now, coming up to our last and traditional question, which we ask all our guests on this podcast, which is one book which you are reading currently, and which is one book that you will advise all the listeners to read?
Well, that's an easy choice because I just read a book which, really had a very deep resonance for me, which is a book called The Hour of the Predator, and it's by Giuliano da Empoli. And it's both a personal insight into the political leaders that are currently dismantling, what we were previously discussing, which was the old order, and putting something new in its place. I mean, it's not a new order because there is no order, but this resort to chaos and unpredictability in international affairs. So, Giuliano D'Ampoli was an advisor to Di Renzo, the Italian Matteo Di Renzo, which the Italian prime minister. But he also has great insights into the world of the tech bros and their approach to change and their messianic belief in their own their own insights and their own and the technology that they control. So I would say get that book. Prepare to be discomforted
Yeah.
and read it.
Kevin, thank you very much for this thoughtful conversation and your valuable insights. Thank you everyone for listening to Oxford Policy Pod. We hope you like this episode, and we hope to see you again here and in the next future episodes. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, guys.